Michael Brooks, welcome to the Nomiki show. First time appearance. Hopefully not the
First,
last time.
first time, long time.
That is very true. First time and long time.
That's right. Good to be back, sort of.
Sort
And
of.
well, because we had our aborted mission yesterday, but
Yeah.
it's
We can tell
awesome.
people about that. Maybe
We had
that
tech
could be
problems.
we had some tech problems. My microphone cut out halfway through the interview. You were on a roll. But maybe we can offer patrons that cut of the interview as some sort of like extra because it's
Okay,
yeah,
go
why
for
not?
it.
I don't know. I'm learning from you.
Absolutely. I
What do
mean, you
do
said
for
some
your-
kind of anti-Semitic stuff in there, but yeah, I don't hold it against you. If you want people to hear it, it's cool.
Now they're going to
I don't
demonetize
care.
me on YouTube because you just said that.
Oh, I said that in the first. Sorry, it was the first
Yes,
minute. Right, I
the
should have
first
waited.
minute. We'll cut that. We'll
Waited.
put that at the end.
Yeah.
So, Michael, welcome to the show. Congratulations on being number one in the What is it? What section are you in? I was just looking at this.
Oh, it's political philosophy. Is
You're
that it?
number one in media and internet in politics.
Boom.
You're killing it on Amazon. I guess people, no one's buying paper anymore. Maybe
And
we're
that's
not
far
even
out because
cutting trees anymore.
I'm telling people to buy it at this place called Red Emma's, which is this independent bookstore.
I love Red Emma's.
Yeah. So like so go don't buy it on Amazon. We're boycotting Amazon. But I will say if the numbers that's great.
Yeah.
Because that means because plenty of people are telling me that they're buying it independently. And if the numbers are still decent on Amazon, that's awesome. People seem to have some interest in the book. That's cool.
Red Emma's should do a, number one sold this week on the internet. And they have a cafe. For those who've never been to Red Emma's in Baltimore, have you been to the actual store?
I've actually never been to the actual store. I'm buddies with the guy who owns it. He actually he came to our Philly live show. And we've hung out a little bit, but I've never had the privilege. I was gonna go do a reading there, but now we don't go places anymore.
No, we don't. You could do a
we
virtual
don't do
reading.
Things anymore.
We don't. We just stare at our webcams all day long if we have one. Drink on Zoom, and sometimes people jump in on our Zoom calls naked or doing other
Has that
shit
happened to
like
you?
porn. It hasn't. We started to do passwords, but we don't have a password on this one, so who knows what's going to happen? Maybe someone will jump into our Zoom call.
Jesus Christ! They have done that to you?
No, they've done it to other people. I've been reading about it. So
yeah, I've been reading about it too. Yeah, it's horrible.
I heard about a guy who's running for Congress who did a town hall and they jumped in on their Zoom.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So some of them are horrible and some of them are pretty funny. That's actually funny.
No. Somebody did porno on a town hall, and it was a predominantly Muslim community. So you can imagine how horrifying that was. Yeah.
It's still a little funny though, on some level.
I think it's like intellectual dark web version 5. Is that no? I don't know.
No, it's more fun.
So in intellectual dark web, this is my kombucha. For those of you who are listening as a podcast, I'm drinking on camera. Not hard kombucha, but it makes
We've
me
seen
feel
you
like I'm
drink on
drinking
camera.
I've
been with you at debate nights. So you're like, Michael, hot. Because Andrew Cuomo is because they got with the members of the IDC. Hold on, Sam. There was the IDC, and they were there, and they set a whole parameter for the debate you're seeing right now.
And
let me get another drink.
Let me get another spiked water because that's all that's in that studio.
Water.
It's like rubbing alcohol in water.
0.2 alcohol percent.
I am a lightweight. You're giving it away.
Fermented guava.
I definitely bring those into the studio. All right. So you have this book. It's great. It's about the intellectual dark web. I have just started reading it as of last night. Not very far in because it's really hard to focus right now. Are you feeling that way too? Just in general?
It honestly, it goes in and out. I mean, sometimes it's extremely hard. Other times I am taking, there is some time to have more quiet and read books and whatever. So there is some of that going on. But obviously, of course it's hard there's a lot cooking right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And Twitter's not helping because
Twitter's not helping. Twitter is trash.
It is total trash. I'm ready. I'm ready to break up with Twitter, but I know it's too powerful of a tool, especially if you're selling a book. So tell me, okay, I really don't know a lot about the intellectual dark web. I'm aware of it because I live on the YouTubes, but I don't interact with it. And any experience I've had interacting with it, it's been because of Fox News. So it's not even legit, intellectual dark web. Meaning like the Ben Shapiro's of the world. I know he's not technically, or maybe
No, he is. He is technically part of it. Yeah.
I've debated him. He's an asshole.
Oh, really?
Like you needed to know that. Breaking news, guys. Yeah. He is an asshole.
Are you telling me that you had a heart that talking to Ben Shapiro was somehow not pleasant?
Well, some of them,
that's shocking.
They're assholes on TV, and then the minute the camera's off, they're genuinely like nice people. Some of them.
Yeah, but I mean, not
like Andrew Breitbart was like that.
Yeah, but not him. I mean, come on.
No, not.
There's no way that kid is like pleasant.
No.
I mean, to be fair to him, like I think he's got a very coherent personality. I don't think there's any difference. I would suspect, like he's just gonna do that little motor mouth thing no matter what. I liked going on like really like when I was going on like I-24.
Oh yeah.
They would have me like occasionally I would get like, and actually I forget the guy's name, but he was some like British, like right wing, like pro-Israel guy. We had an Ilhan Omar debate and I kicked his ass. And he was actually like really, but it was funny. Like he definitely was like, it would be like 50-50. Like he was legit in the sense that he had the accent, he knew how to whatever. And the other people that they had on, like I started joking, like I don't care, it's pretty much done. But like I would joke to the bookers. I was like, all right, like Trump did something, I don't like it, and there's somebody who like escaped from an institution who does like a public access cable show who really digs it, and we're gonna debate. Like,
oh my god, no!
And I remember I loved.
And now they're like the communications directors for the White House.
Right, that was the thing. That's true. That's true. I definitely did. There were a couple of them that I'd look up after because I mostly had no idea who they were.
Right.
And there was like one or two I looked up after, and they were just like, "Oh my god, that person has like a real position."
A lot of them. My favorite we're so off topic, but my favorite was the weather girl from Fox News Weekends Mornings. She is now the communications director for the Defense Department. And she's like, in news in Afghanistan, it's sunny today. Like, what the fuck is she? Wait, that's where they were casting the communications people. So any complaints you have about Bernie Sanders and his, non-traditional team, just look at the White House right now. I mean, they're running a full propaganda unit and it's working.
Right. Yeah, but he needs to do that on the other side.
Exactly.
Right? Like after like, all right, I'm president, and now, I mean, yeah. So, I don't even know what the Bernie equivalent of that would be. Actually,
it would be us on Twitter. It would just be all. It would be us. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what he's done, and you need fighters. You need people who can like take on Neera Tanden and not be afraid of her like army of trolls. So let's talk about what you're here to talk about, which is your book.
Yes. Well, and really whatever.
And anything. Yeah. But I want to know. I want to learn from you. I don't want to actually read the book. I just want to talk to you and pretend I know.
I knew that this was that hustle, basically. It's a very well-written book, though.
Okay, fine. I'll read it. If you do say so yourself, it's a well-written book.
It is. I do say so myself.
Okay, so this intellectual dark web, kind of a new thing, at least in labels, in terms of like, people who do not live on the internet, it's new. Why are these people so influential? When we were talking yesterday, we talked a little bit about how they're preying on a portion of the internet that would be susceptible to this. Maybe people who think they're more intellectual than they are. Or like, explain to me, what is this mechanism?
Like basically what's interesting to me about these people, and no doubt, like when I got contracted to write this book, like they were popping. They were getting profiled in the New York Times. They were like all over the place. Jordan Peterson was like an actual international sensation. Right. Now this stuff is way, 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 way less on the map. But I think what's interesting to me about it is I start the book with like just a metaphor basically that I got from my friend Bhaskar Sankara, who founded Jacobin magazine, right? And he wrote in a piece, I think for the New York Times, where he was like, look, like not literally, but let's just take these three destinations as three different ways of doing politics. Let's say there's Hungary, which is like the resurgence, which we see more and more every day, of right-wing authoritarian politics. Then let's take Singapore, and Singapore is actually also pretty authoritarian. It's very market-oriented, but it's technocratic. It has a certain type of diversity. It values it has a different way of doing things, right? And you could definitely see like Mike Bloomberg,
Right.
Davos, a lot of the people in the Democratic Party, this is the world that they idealize. This is the Fareed Zakaria world. And then he was saying, then there's like Finland Station. And Finland Station is where Lenin got back to basically like to go for before the 1917 Russian Revolution. Some people get really triggered by this. This is not like a big conversation about the Soviet Union or whatever, though that's an interesting conversation. But it's just the idea that that moment was a revolutionary moment. And the belief was, and I think this belief manifests in a variety of ways, whether we're talking about like the Workers' Party in Brazil or FDR or the African National Congress or 1917, this idea that like politics is really about expanding democracy into all spheres of life, including economic, right? That's a really simple way, I think, of kind of understanding a certain type of socialist viewpoint. And I think when you do have that kind of politics, you recognize that the world in terms of power right now is mostly a contest between Hungary and Singapore, and that Hungary is rising. And the interesting thing to me about the dark web was that it kind of is, because there is arguments inside of it, it covers a lot of Singapore style and Hungary style arguments for a popular audience. And I thought, really with the exception of what they don't have and what is more ascendant right now is this like, not in terms of policy, but like people who are doing like actual right-wing populism, that is in terms of economics, that is not in there. But you could look at like Sam Harris as a Singapore style guru for sure. And you could look at Jordan Peterson, who did meet with Viktor Orban and does have this real fixation with mythology and natural hierarchy, as a Hungry sort of figure. And so what I think all of these people do is they take, they try to either naturalize hierarchies through science or through mythology, right? So like we can't really challenge how the market works because that just is what it is, right? And if you're
it's an assumed truth.
It's an assumed truth. It's like oxygen. And so that's the kind of like where they're coming from. And I think in terms of the weaknesses that they were able to appeal to, though, is that particularly when they were rising on the scene, the left was mostly associated in people's minds with just kind of like a narrow moralism, like, hey, don't say that, don't do that, that's not cool, blah, 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 without a kind of like more full, either compelling dynamic of argument of how we actually want things to be, or a big, broad set of answers for everybody. Right? Like if you can come out of 2008
that's right.
For several years and primarily not have like a big narrative that can actually speak to the crisis most people are going through, that's a huge failing. And I think they're a manifestation of exploiting that weakness, and we can provide way more compelling answers. And the last thing I'll just say real quick is I think like the conclusion of my book is by far what I'm most excited about, because I'm not going to like, I felt like there was a time where I did videos about these people because it is in this YouTube space. It is in this, you know, it's in the air. They're still around. They're still popular. They still matter. I don't want to, like, I'm kind of bored by them. I think that it's important to understand them and get where they fit. I don't really care. I know that some people, you know, say that I'm unfair, blah, blah, blah. They'll do the usual kind of complaining. But I think the bigger thing here is like, these arguments that they present are going to be arguments that are going to be with us for a long time, whether or not it's them making it. And that this kind of like cosmopolitan socialist viewpoint that I'm putting forward, I think actually is a really good answer or framework for a left that is way more confident, way more appealing, way more global, and also really materially grounded in people's lives. So that's what I'm excited about. And that's definitely what I try to do on my show.
Well, it's interesting because I the way that I see this, and I've studied a lot about Roger Ailes and sort of how 2 generations ago he attempted to tap into that generation's version of the disaffected, disenchanted, white man who felt like the government was becoming too diverse, too focused on women, too big business, whatever it is. It's actually very similar to the Trump same base, basically. It's just, that's a base that turns out in votes, and in a Republican primary, it was disruptive enough to get him Trump the election. But, for our generation, I think that their appeal this is their demographic, the way that they're going to be able to cling on to whatever version, whatever the right looks like moving forward in a country that is proving to be more and more populist, and our generation being more and more and younger, more and more populist, leftist, and just as you state, cosmopolitan, like literally actually cosmopolitan. More people are living in cities up until COVID. Who knows what's going to happen after this?
Yeah, who knows where people will go? Yeah.
So
sorry, go ahead.
So no, I'm just curious, like, what does cosmopolitan socialism mean for us moving forward? I mean, how does it look? What does it sound like? And how does it challenge these ideas that are not going away? They're just probably going to take another form with the next generation and the next technology and platform that allows them the ability to mobilize and speak out.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think that what's a little bit different about them is I think that part of it is like the through line of that kind of Roger Ailes thing for sure. But I think there's also a lot of there's a self-help element to it,
right,
which is really different and really relevant. I also think there's people like, look, a guy like Sam Harris is a Democrat. Like it is not, and that doesn't mean anything to me, right? Like that's not a big reflection of somebody's politics, but it is broader than just that kind of like traditional, we're right wing and we're going to find what's kind of bugging people right now to get them. And I also think like, and this will like pivot into your question really specifically. I'm also like of the school that like, okay, even if it's primarily appealing to young men and primarily appealing to young white men, so what, right? Like right. That's like the kind of thing too that like I thought there was so much doors. Like if you were, say, in that demographic and you're 18 and you're reading around, I actually had an anecdote like this. I was at an event in Boise, Idaho, and there was this really cool kid who was driving me around from DSA, came and met me at the airport, whatever, and we started talking. He was a really, really smart, I shouldn't say kid, like a young man, really smart, really together person. And, his trajectory was like, yeah, I started getting interested in this sort of thing. It felt like, I could read some like piece about why like I shouldn't like Seinfeld or I sucked because whatever, and then I would look at like a conversation with Sam Harris or something, and they were talking about science and they were talking about different ideas, some of which are kind of interesting. And then maybe they were also now in retrospect promoting some politics I totally don't agree with, but it made a lot of intuitive sense. And then he said, and again, this just happened to be me. I think there's a lot of people like this. He found me and other kind of people. It was like, first was like, okay, you had really good debunks, but also like you were talking about my life. You weren't just saying like, oh, you're privileged, blah, 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 blah. You're talking about my student loans. You're talking about my healthcare. You're talking about my parents' retirement. You're talking about real shit. You're not just like giving another kind of like sort of simplistic, moralistic view of the world. And so I think like my specific angle with this, like, kind of like globalized view of socialism and a globalized answer is that there's sort of like these two tendencies right now that are really showing up, and they kind of cut across right and left. And one is this idea that like there are not universals. There really are only like culturally mediated experiences, and we cannot have common bonds beyond them. And it's funny because in the United States, I think a lot of people associate, like, there is a certain type of woke argument that really makes this case. And it gets really like, I just had this woman, Joanna Vista, on my shows, like talking about how really important research and disparity studies have been weaponized in the policy process in the last decade to undermine things like Medicare for all. Like it's literally undermined absolutely necessary policy efforts, right? And then even way more dangerously, we see like Hungary, and we see this kind of like resurgent nationalism, and there's this Israeli intellectual who's writing like the new democracy has to be nationalistic. There cannot be universal standards. There only is the nation state, and the nation state defines its own community, period. Like that's it, right? So you got this like rising tendency. And in response to a lot of the people, and again, the dark web represents different things around this too, because there's definitely a lot of stuff that I consider to be anti-Muslim. There's definitely all sorts of very toxic racial and gender stuff from my perspective, no question. But these are also people who are to some extent holding a perverse view of the opposite, which is that like, yes, there are universal values, there are universal standards, and those things came from the West, basically, right? Like, so in this, and I'll loop it like this. In the 1990s, there was a really big argument with the so-called like Asian tiger countries, like countries like Malaysia and Singapore. And they would say, like, fuck you, we do human rights. We have a different conception of human rights because we're Confucian. So we don't just valorize the individual. And then Western critics would be like, you guys are full of it. You're obviously violating people's right to free speech or whatever. And everybody wants the same thing. And what Amartya Sen, who's a big influence on this book, who's this Indian economist, came forward and was like, both sides of this equation are wrong, in the sense that like 100% there are universals. And if we don't have an ability to build universals, there's also going to be no left project, because the only way labor could ever confront power is with masses of people. And if you can't build serious bonds, not just with like shared moral commitments or shared ways of talking, that is always going to be really small. You need to build something out much bigger, much more inviting, and much more aggressive. And then on the other hand, what San said was where the Western chauvinists are wrong is that let's actually read everybody and look across the world. And of course, we can find in Confucianism or in Islam or anywhere the building blocks of open societies, freedom of speech, holding power accountable, whatever, inquiry. And even when we get into like, what is the West? Like, that's bullshit. Greece, what was ancient Greece included was African, it was Pan-Asian, particularly by the time we get to Rome. So what I'm trying to say actually is one, it's like the answer to these guys is like, yes, there is like this compelling global experience we can have that really enlarges our perspective. It doesn't shrink it. It doesn't get us into these narrow arguments. It actually really widens the lens. And it's a much more exciting way of being in the world. And I think, and then what answers to them and also coalesces with building that serious socialistic, anti-racist, and globalized movement is this idea that we literally have to cross-pollinate across boundaries. Like when I do histories on my show of like, we just did 2 parts on Samara Machel, who was this Mozambican revolutionary. There's relevance in things that he put across to 2020 right now where we are, 100%. And not like a stretch, like, oh, I can see how that. It's like, no, like very direct parallels. So we can start to be this way. And I think that, it also provides a way more compelling way of taking on this stuff than being woke. Because instead of essentializing, instead of policing, instead of like narrowing the scope, you're actually really widening it. So that's
Absolutely.
what I'm trying to do.
And that's kind of, you and I have had this conversation offline quite a bit, our allergy to woke culture. And it's ironically triggering for a lot of people who identify as DSA members and are democratic socialists of our generation who live in these cosmopolitan, cities. They live in New York. There's several chapters of DSA in New York. And oftentimes, if they're in the electoral groups, it kind of gets, the electoralism gets distracted by the need to create the appearance of being woke because it is a tool of organizing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Meaning the way that electoral politics works in America is, okay, we need to make sure that the African-American base over the age of 60 shows up or else we don't win. We need to make sure that the Latino neighborhood turns out. And so suddenly the language of electoralism is not so much about what you're saying, opening and broadening the base, but about basically micro-targeting and finding people that represent those neighborhoods and represent, traditional political language for older voters who may not necessarily digest, intersectional, economic, whatever type of language you have. So, this is, the reason I asked about the cosmopolitan side of this is how in an era where we are trying to organize our generation, which is still, is falling into wokeness, which is not a new thing. This has happened, like you just said, throughout history. Identity has been thrown out there as a weapon or putting factions against each other, whatever it is, wherever somebody's from. But I think like our struggle as being, you know, millennials and younger, being the largest and most diverse generations in history, who are dealing with an extraordinary economy and just likely to get much, much worse. How is it that we can, number one, stay in solidarity, but then also appeal to older demos the way that Bernie Sanders wasn't able to, because he was trying to speak to our generation, but he couldn't at the same time speak to an older generation that just is not there. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a lot there.
there's a lot.
To me, it's like, no, it's good. I think, first of all, I think a lot of this like woke stuff, what's interesting to me, like, I think it's actually extremely narrow and extremely American and speaks to extremely small demos.
Yeah.
So I would make, and this is what I'm trying to do here, is like, I think on one hand, what has really been lost, and actually people were constantly talking about like, oh, Bernie Sanders needs how to learn how to do this, needs how to learn to do that. And there was some truth to that at times, which I'll get to in a second. But it's like, everybody needs to learn how to do what actually he did fantastically, which is speak in clear, moral, and obvious narratives about things that affect 99% of people.
Exactly.
And you need to do that. That's the material ground of it. There is a part that is like, and you know, I've talked with Adolf Reed about this, like, you can't, the part where it's like the distinction between like, okay, we're gonna do an action, we're gonna work on something. Obviously, if somebody shows up to a meeting and is like saying all sorts of like bigoted things and they can't sit next to somebody because they're from a different background or whatever, that's not going to work. You literally can't work from that base. Now, on the flip side, maybe somebody's going to come to a meeting and they're not trained in all of the various speaking patterns that you're used to. Maybe they have a different set of cultural preferences. Maybe they don't accept, like, they can accept like the very clear broad base of like opposing sexism or racism, but maybe they don't agree with all of your specific attunements and your very narrow definition of what that actually means. So I think on one part, there's actually just like getting back to really simple, like, look, if you go home and watch and listen and do whatever the hell you want, as long as you're like not hurting anybody, and then we'll do politics together. And it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what your cultural practices are. Like, I actually think there needs to be just some real, like, getting totally out of like, this is not a social club.
Right.
It's actually literally not a safe space, because I'll even just like take it at face value. Like, that's cool. If you want to generate that, then generate that. That's a different activity. Like, create a small support group with a small group of people who are working through something together. That's totally valid. That's not politics. So I think that's one part of it.
And it's easy. I mean, I have to say, like, it's a very cheap way of dealing with politics. I think a lot of folks can get quick, easy wins on the internet through being provocative with woke and cancel culture, because it's an easy way to work through your enemies. It's an easy way to mobilize people, but it's not going to deliver you the long-term wins that we all need.
And it's not real wins. Like, it might be a win for like a career advancement or whatever, but it's not appealing to a broad set of people, and it's literally not a win. I mean, like, this is what I'm saying. Like, even stuff that's actually more like real but difficult. Like, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe with COVID, maybe we're entering something different. But that period of weeks where people were saying like, oh, well, Bernie lost, but 60% of people support single parent, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He lost. That's literally the only thing that mattered. So don't tell yourself a bedtime story. We have to figure out what the problem was and how. And I think the next two parts here that I want to say that are related to that question, though, is like, on another area where I don't care about the terminology. Like, I don't think cosmopolitan socialism is something to throw around for a whole bunch of people. But the attitude I'm talking about is, well, number one, okay, so let's go back to Bernie. Bernie's coalition needs to be way more diverse. 100% correct, no doubt. Well, first of all, let's frame it as an addition and not a subtraction, because we don't want to lose what was already built. that's how you, because we're trying to like win.
Which he did, by the way.
Right. Which he did. And that's a major problem. Exactly. And then secondly, what are the actual strategies and literacies to actually do that? Because then it becomes like, well, if your task is to appeal, like, you know, let's just take it in a hypothetical direction. If I need to persuade my grandmother in Long Island to vote for Bernie Sanders, I am not going to hire or talk to, you know, like a 22-year-old, like anti-Israel Jewish activist from Swarthmore. Like, you know, so then that was the second part. It's like, even when it's true, then what are we actually doing here? And then that brings me to the third part, which to me is really paradoxical. And I always find like kind of funny with my show, because like I'm very willing and increasingly just totally intolerant of this kind of like identitarian bullshit in the Adolph Reed terminology. And then at the same time, it's like I actually see so many conversations where it's just like, I think calling the black vote is actually really problematic. I think it's totally inaccurate. It literally, and this is a favorite word, erases a massive amount of distinctions of geographic, ideological, and economic diversity inside one of the most important dynamic communities globally, not just in the United States. So then all of a sudden to have a dynamic where like a whole bunch of cynical Democratic Party operatives who will use this discourse for a day and they'll throw it out tomorrow, they don't give a fuck. They will make it that, well, all the black vote is African Americans over 60 in South Carolina. That's it. It is certainly not an immigrant from Trinidad and Brooklyn. It is certainly not a labor union organizer in Wisconsin. It is definitely not, you know, somebody who has like a small chain of businesses in Southern California, or maybe it is, depending on who they're contributing to. But it's definitely this one very specific slice. And then that's cynically wielded against Bernie. And then on the flip side, yeah, there is this other discourse of like, right, that does need the approach needs to be different. And therefore, like, you know, okay, but who, like, obviously, like, Nina Turner's an incredible campaigner, and Bernie did bring in people that were really amazing. In fact, one of the things that frustrates me is I actually see a lot of this from outside of the campaign itself, even. But I see people who didn't even support Bernie, and definitely people around Warren and elsewhere, sort of like, well, X, Y, and Z needs to be done, but we actually are totally not the ones to do it.
Right.
And we don't have the discursive strategies. We don't have, so, you know, it's like.
Yeah, the Warren facade of like, they kept saying, oh, you keep erasing all these diverse, you know, women who've supported Warren. It's like, no, those were the diverse, notable women who supported Warren. On the actual voting side, it was a bunch of white, wealthy, highly educated people that are New York Times, you know, readers, and that's it. Like, they won the New York Times.
Like literally
audience.
That's like it. Including like more men when you like broke down the so I think, like, to me, this attitude that I'm talking about would actually really get into way more intricacy. I think it would both at the same time try to historicize things and try to look at things in a more like less moralistic and more economic and political lens. And then on the other hand, it actually would say, like, it isn't just sufficient to have like a strategy for this or that group. Right. It's actually like, you better fucking understand something about this or that group, right? Both in their own terms and also how it relates to a broader experience. Because that's the funny thing to me about so much of those discourses, is that they actually they're really essentializing the ways that we reject as from like a socialist position, but they're also just like, they erase in their own terminology so much nuance and so many things that are necessary to properly communicate a message and also build things in peer-to-peer relationships. Because the last thing I'll say, like, you see, absolutely, there's people who like totally bitch and complain about the South Carolina vote in ways they 100% should not. And they reveal a lot of nonsense when they say it, no doubt, right? I totally agree with that. And then there's other people that are like, well, because it's the South Carolina, like, you can't talk about it which is also totally ridiculous. And then other people even use, and we started to see this like in 2017, like literally white people like tweeting like gifs of or memes of like black women going to vote, like almost as if all these bizarre, and they are mostly boomer liberal white people. It's like they are essentializing it to make it. It's like, this isn't Green Mile. This is the country.
That's what
it's actually really offensive.
Yeah.
And really, it's horrifying. So
it was an emblem. I was like, 100%. I wanted to say, and many of my good friends were those women who were diverse, great activists, by the way, have great reputations for the work that they do in their communities. And I legitimately think they wanted a woman that was leaning progressive. And maybe they didn't get phone calls from Bernie Sanders, which is his own issue, is that he's not very good at the politics and the outreach. We're humans and people like to get personal phone calls. So I hear them on that sense. But with that being said, the entire campaign was like, it was like an emblem for the white wealthy woman, possibly former Hillary voter, most likely, who was feeling guilty and wanted to look like she had a bunch of, women of color as friends. And this is what were their ways of making up for it.
Yeah,
the 2016 election, because they also painted that narrative. Sorry, just a side note.
No, go ahead.
The narrative about blaming white women for Donald Trump was also completely false. I mean, it was white men who were wealthy that won him the election, and in several cases, their wives or partners voted with them, which is completely congruent with all historical trends, not just 2016. What lost Hillary the vote, let's just say it over and over again, was the fact that she did not engage working people. She lost people who made under $45,000 a year. She didn't show up in places like Philadelphia, which is a stronghold for Democrats. She didn't show up in places like Wisconsin, as we know. And at the end of the day, it didn't have to do with all of these identity, they tried to blame it on identities. It blamed the white woman and black women show up. They do, sure. But guess what? Nobody did under $45,000 a year in the Democratic Party at the rates that she needed to. And that's what she didn't want to address. So it becomes an excuse, as you know, and in a way.
No, I think I love it. And I think like what's also right is just is actually coming at it from both directions, which is either like, let's just take the top lines and realize that this is just a really simplistic, misleading way of understanding what happened electorally, or let's go in the opposite direction and really get into the intricacies of what we're talking about here. Because even like just the discourse, like, look, I don't care. You want to talk about like the privilege of white men or whatever, that's fine. And there's obviously relative truth to it. It's fine. I think, I think it's a little bit 2014, but I think, but there's truth to it. Of course, there's no doubt. Nobody would deny it. There's truth to that. And at the same time, like a discourse that would suggest that somebody, in Akron making $18,000 a year is privileged,
right?
Because their name is Bob Smith and they're a straight white guy, is like, it's insane. Like, it's not just wrong, it's like demented. And I think the other thing that is important to look at here, and this is another parallel I want to draw with Adolph Reed, because Adolph Reed then, first of all, he also talks about the problem with like the brokerage role then. If you make demographics and different populations like not just human beings with specific histories and specific trajectories, but like magical things that need to be understood, then it becomes like not politics. It becomes like, okay, I need to like have somebody that can understand the secret psychology of like the Jewish electorate or whatever, versus just like, yes, of course, you need to hire people from different backgrounds, and you need people who are literate and competent across the board, but there isn't like these magical keys that take different groups of people outside of history, right? And I think like the other thing that I wanted to note that I really got from Adolph Reed was like, if you go to the 1990s, and of course it's not the same, like the damage is not the same, but it's fascinating to me because if you look at the 1990s, we all know Republicans did this, but Democrats were all over this. Like, we would say, yes, there's poverty and crime in urban America because of deindustrialization, because American apartheid basically ended like 40 years ago legally, and there has been nothing systemically to adjust that at all. Not only has there been nothing systemically to adjust that, as soon as it started like legally started to come down, we basically start gutting America's social infrastructure. So of course we're going to go into the 1990s and there's going to be problems, right? But everybody, the New Republic, everybody was all over like, oh, you know, and Bill Clinton, cultures of poverty, and you know, it's not because of all the obvious things. It's because of rap music, like all of this shit. Now most people kind of understand that if they don't really want to talk about it, but most people understand that was super racist, very embarrassing and pathetic. Now, it is not the same thing, because there's no doubt that the stakes of anti-African American racism is completely different. And I wouldn't even call it, like, anti-white rhetoric is not racist in the same sense. We all understand that. But if we were to look at this stuff just as like, forget the content, let's just say we're like playing a game or we're writing a screenplay, you know, like you get a book like about how to write a screenplay, and it's like, you know, it's like, hey, whether you're writing like Beverly Hills Cop or fucking Field of Dreams or whatever, it's all the same structure, right? All of the shit that you see coming out from like woke stuff to just explain the Trump electorate is the same narrative structure as the stuff about poverty in the 90s. It's all, these people are just, they just don't get it. They've got bad morals. They don't know how to work. And then of course it's, you know, totally layered with the same thing you were talking about earlier, which is like, well, I can feel good about myself because I'm not one of these other, you know, terrible white people that's a racist. I have to say, as much as I'm like rejecting identitarian politics, there isn't a single trajectory of bad politics that doesn't start from affluent suburban white people or urban white people. So you have this whole other dynamic, and nobody's looking at even the material base of the Trump vote. Someone made this, I'll be real quick, someone made this great point to me, like, even in like these, okay, say you're in some depressed little town in Maine, there's no jobs. Yeah, probably you don't have it's very possible you don't have super enlightened attitudes. But you're also going to a Trump rally because the person who owns the quarry, which is maybe the only place in town where you can get a job, is going to be at that rally. Your minister probably is, which is the only social cohesion group. And then who else? The cop chief and the fire chief, in case anything goes down, you know. Yeah. You don't want to get a fucking ticket for driving drunk. Like, even that has a material base. And I think people need to just really unlearn, particularly in America, and definitely liberals, stop looking at like these moral narratives of why things happen. That's usually not where things start.